Welcome to the Beau Show. Today's show will be a little different in the respect that I will be telling you a personal story that I hope will give you a sense of inspiration and motivation. It's a story that's very, very fresh in my mind, and it's a first for me in a sense. 1 year ago on September 13th, I was coming back from a fishing trip in Arkansas on the White River. For those of you who love river fishing for trout, this is the place. My grandparents used to live in a small town on this river, so some of my early memories as a child were visiting their house, playing on the swing that my grandfather made that overlooked this river, and shooting a BB gun from a ledge. This place kind of has that Mayberry feel to it. Down-home people, good neighbors, no crime really to speak of, freshly grown vegetables in the yard, a birdhouse for martins, and this river around which everything is situated. The two types of trout you try to catch are the rainbow trout, the most common species there, and the more elusive brown trout. My grandfather taught my dad how to fish, and in turn, my dad taught me how to fish as well. The river in summer mornings has a beautiful, dense fog that coats it, and you can hear boats navigating through it even if you can't see them. On the weekend of September 13th of last year, I took a trip with my father to fish this very same river, which we've been doing for a very long time. Although I haven't been able to go as much in recent years due to work and being in cities that are far away from this place. In 2019, I caught the largest rainbow trout I've ever caught before, which was significant. And then last year, I caught an albino rainbow trout, which, as you can imagine, is a rarity. I mention these two significant events because, in hindsight, they represent rarities and time well spent. For a period of years, I had friction with my dad, and so there were times that we didn't speak. But in more recent times, we were, able to work through those challenges, and that took a certain amount of humility and forgiveness. My dad and I were able to visit some of our cousins in Arkansas that I hadn't seen in forever, so that was special too. We left from Arkansas to head back to Tennessee, which is about a 4-hour trip, give or take. As we left, we stopped the truck to see these two deer that were giving us a good look. And that's just another one of those great natural wonders that you should sometimes pause to see. As we crossed over the bridge from Arkansas to Tennessee, we were a mere 20 minutes or so from our destination. My dad asked me to navigate with his phone, so I picked it up and began to open up the map. It's at this point that time stops and skips. The next thing that I remember is being wheeled in for a CT scan and asking where I was and why I was there. They told me that I had been in an accident. My right arm was completely bandaged and my vision was blurry. As I returned to my hospital room in trauma, of course, I had many questions. The best news that I got was that there was no brain damage or internal bleeding. I was told that my dad was not there in the trauma unit, which was not necessarily alarming because maybe I was just worse off. And with COVID protocols, you probably know that relatives can't really come see you. I called my mother, who was not expecting the call at all, and certainly not from an unknown hospital number. I explained to her that we had been in a car accident and that I didn't know where Dad was, but maybe to try calling him. She wasn't that alarmed either, seemingly, and I think it maybe comforted her to know that I was okay. What I didn't know was that she made some calls to inquire thereafter, and a Memphis police officer was on the way over to speak with her. Unbeknownst to me, he informed her that my dad had immediately passed away in this accident. A driver who was high on multiple illegal drugs lost control of her car, came speeding over a flat, grassy median with no guardrail at a speed of about 90 miles per hour and struck our truck head on as we drove about 70 miles per hour. That combined impact would be somewhere around 150, 160 miles per hour. That driver and my dad died upon impact. I somehow survived it, hitting every airbag but breaking my ulna, my nose, and doing damage to my eyes and knocking me totally unconscious. Doctors in the trauma unit seemed to imply it just wasn't my time, because people don't usually survive those types of high-speed collisions. I went in for surgery for my arm that night, and after I came out, I heard the news about my dad. I don't think I knew the real weight of it until a few days later, when I went to see the truck in the impound lot to see the damage. It was horrific. Because I don't remember anything about the wreck itself, it's like an out-of-body experience. It's like you know you were there, but you have no recollection of it. It was two mashed up vehicles that looked like crinkled up aluminum foil, debris and glass everywhere. Both of our watches were completely blown off of our wrists, and I found pieces of both of them. A stick of my deodorant in the back that was in a duffel bag completely pulverized, a warped steering wheel, and oddly, a perfectly intact iPhone underneath the seat, the very one I was holding when we were hit. I sang and I gave a eulogy for my dad's funeral less than a week later. And I was given a certain amount of calm and peace that day that I think can only come from God above. Now, you may be thinking how terrible this all is, and in many ways it is, but my dad was just 71. But where this story shifts is what was done before and after this, what some call God winks. These are the blessings that you don't always see in the moment. I've mentioned the deer that we saw that day and the albino trout. Those were significant rarities. But when I came to Tennessee, a mere 4 months before this accident, my dad had me come with him to firm up his living will so that I would know how to do everything when the time came, and I'm his only child. We didn't know that time was going to be so soon. In addition, over the next few months, I spent hours and hours transferring these old 8mm videotapes to DVD of me as a kid and our family vacations and all these old memories that we both got the chance to relive by watching them. I even saw videos of us on that very same river when I might have been no more than 4 years old. That's what you would call true quality time. I vividly remember text messages from my dad from maybe a few years ago when he said something to the effect of, "My time is coming and maybe sooner than we think." Was he referring to an illness that he wasn't disclosing? I didn't know. Now I guess I do. In his shorts the day of the accident were pieces of paper stapled that had all of his pertinent information that I would need to know. Passwords to his phone, for instance. All of this incredible information. And when I went to his house in preparation to sell it, there's always a weird feeling you get to see a person's living situation when they're gone. I had just been to this house no more than a week or two before when I was transferring those videotapes. But on one of his nightstands was a Bible that was bookmarked to Ecclesiastes 3, which goes, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." On the other nightstand was a book that his sister, my aunt, had given him entitled, "What Happens After Life? 21 Revelations About Heaven and Hell," written by Ron Rhodes. Do you think these nightstand items were just coincidence? I don't. He had told his sister, my aunt, that when he came to see them on a prior trip, it might be his last trip up that way. I don't know why he would say that, but I believe God may have given him a premonition. Maybe that's why he was preparing to leave this earth so meticulously. He was getting his finances and his affairs in order. And I suppose, just as importantly, showing his love for me by making it easy for me to go through this process. The death of a parent takes a certain emotional toll. Some children prepare for it because a parent's health may deteriorate over time. And in my case, I wasn't prepared at all, but he was, which is why everything that happened before and what I've learned afterwards are so significant. This is where I have found the blessings in spite of the tragedy. My dad watched his dad suffer through colon cancer and die. He told me that he didn't want a slow death like that. He wanted it to be quick. And in many ways, I'm glad he got that wish. In another Bible of his that I found in his office, he had the quote of what he wanted on his headstone. Be nice to everyone along your path. A simple mantra for a simple man. He wasn't overly complex. He also left me a treasure map, if you will, to coins that he had buried in pickle jars in his backyard. That was fun to dig up and gave me something to smile about. He certainly had a sense of humor. Our last day on that river was one of those times that I mentioned before where a dense fog began to set in. And while he was looking ahead as our boat was going forward, I took a photo of him looking into the fog. He didn't know I was taking it. And when I see it now, it's like he's peering into the heaven almost. But it's also comforting. I couldn't have known that would be the last photo I would take of him, but I'm glad that I did. It's a reminder of a moment caught in time. And lessons that I have taken from this tragedy are twofold. One is that I think everyone should face their own mortality and prepare accordingly. I don't mean to be morbid, but when I think about all the things that my dad did in preparation for himself and for me, and even his own funeral, he thought this through. He had set aside a time after his funeral for people to eat and gather. That was his style. But when we put the finishing touches on his living will so that I would know how to execute everything properly, it reminds me of the temporal nature of life. And we just don't know when our time is up. I can still see him sitting there in our estate attorney's office, cracking jokes about his own death. I don't think he was scared of it. So I think everyone, out of love for your family, should be proactive with this type of planning. It will make things so much easier for them because it's going to be hard. And then another lesson that I've taken away from all of this is considering your own spiritual path. My dad was a Christian, but when I see what he was reading before his passing, I think he was trying to get right with God and preparing. If you aren't ready to face your own mortality, at least be ready to face your faith and your spirituality. If you believe in life after death, it stands to reason that you should prepare your soul because it's far more important to consider. You don't have to think about death to think about what happens after it. And in turn, that may change the way that you act. There's a famous country song by Tim McGraw called Live Like You Were Dying. Those are some good words to live by. If you knew that this was your last day on earth, what would you do? We procrastinate a lot. I'm certainly guilty of that. And because we don't know when we will draw our last breath, another lesson to learn is to not go to bed angry or with tension, because you may not get another chance to set things right. I don't think anyone wants to live in regret, either about what they said to someone or what they didn't say to someone. I recently lost a friend of mine around my age who sang with me back in the day to a very strange, unexpected complication from surgery. There are kids out there now that don't have a mom. Sadly, I've seen a lot of death in the past year or so, and I bet you have too, especially with COVID. And a lot of those people had to die alone. In many ways, I'm grateful that I got to be right next to my dad at the exact moment that his soul departed. And on the heels of a fulfilling and memorable fishing trip. If you think about it, fishing is kind of a metaphor for life. Someone has to teach you how to do it. You have to prepare. You have to go out there and be incredibly patient and quiet. Your line may get hung up, and you have to cut bait, as they say, and start all over again. Sometimes you get a big one on the line, and you can't bring him in the boat. And sometimes you do, and you get to proudly display your catch. Life has all of those elements. I think it's fitting that my dad left this earth right after just such an experience. It's a full circle thing, a complete run, if you will. Life gives you blessings if you are willing to notice them and appreciate them, which also fits into this fishing metaphor. The nature that you get to see on that river is exceptional, but you have to be willing to look around you, and you have to see the blue herons and the bald eagles, the elusive brown trout that belly flops out of the water. You have to appreciate the sunrise and the sunset and the dense fog. I remember that years ago on this very same river that the water was really, really high and the current was really swift, so swift that our boat capsized and it flipped over. I had to grab a life jacket from under the boat at the last second and cling to a tree and wait there until someone could throw me a rope to get to shore. That wasn't expected at all, and it was very dangerous. That's life for you. I was with my dad when I got my one and only hole-in-one a few years ago. This is the beauty of experiences. You have to cherish those. To use another boat metaphor, I think about that great quote from Mark Twain, which goes like this: 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off the bow lines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover. That's the charge he gives us. I certainly feel blessed to have been given about 40 years with my father, and I'm his only child, so now this generational line is down to me. I bear the same name as him and my grandfather. I remember a great story by Rivers Rutherford, a famous Nashville songwriter. He talks about having a vision of seeing his granddaddy in a field, but he was much younger, a much younger, stronger man than he remembered him. It was like he was working in the fields of heaven. That was the basis for the song he wrote for Brad Paisley and Dolly Parton called When I Get Where I'm Going. In real life, when Rivers saw his granddaddy's headstone, and because he carried the same name as his granddaddy, he came face to face with his own mortality by seeing his own name on his granddaddy's grave. I share that exact same type of mortality by seeing my grandfather's and now my father's name in the same place, at the same cemetery. The only difference is our suffix. 658,000 Americans came face to face with death attributed to this pandemic. They likely weren't expecting that at all. I think it's kind of important that we all come to terms with our own mortality and the brevity of life. If we only lived life more like we were dying, as Tim McGraw sings, I hope that we wouldn't sweat the small stuff and that we would appreciate each other and our experiences more. I fully realize that watching the news every day can be downright depressing and even fear-mongering. I had a lot of personal loss in the year 2020, from relationships to friends to my father. But if you don't see the grace or the opportunity to grow in these dismal periods, perhaps you aren't seeing the bigger picture. The reason that I am comforted by the way things happened with my father's passing is that I have a strong faith, and so did he. And I could tell by what he was reading the months leading up to his death, he was preparing. Maybe God gave him some clues, or God winks, as I keep calling them. And then in looking back, all of the things that happened just before it, a father-son reconciliation after a period of friction and tension, a pandemic that, as bad as it was, created an opportunity for us to spend time together in Memphis, the revisiting of a living will, the ability to spend time collectively with him and my mom, the great fishing trip on a river that he and I both learned to fish on from my grandfather. I would be blind if I didn't notice these things. But maybe I was spared so that I could tell you this story, to tell you how you can find peace and grace. By no means am I fully whole or complete after what happened. It's difficult to find forgiveness when a close person is ripped away from you for no apparent reason. I think about that great ending scene in the movie Big Fish, when Edward has his homegoing, so to speak, and he sees everyone he ever knew, and there isn't a sad face to be found. It's his proper send-off, and then his son places him back in the river. This movie depicts him as having conflicts with his son, But there he is in the end, carrying him into the river and letting him basically go back to the river as a legendary big fish. You can imagine all of the fitting metaphors between this story and my own, and similarly, the grace with which he leaves the world. I hope that in my telling of this story, that it affects at least some part of your life today, whether that's in the more practical aspects I talked about or in the spiritual elements. I hope you'll address both. In my view, my story is just getting started. I expect to see many more divine God winks all along my journey. Till we meet again, Dad, I love you, and I know that we will. I'm Beau, and that's the show.